Where are we living, actually?
Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for Legacies of the Gulag, Russian Camps Past and Present. First of all, let me take a moment to thank and introduce our distinguished speakers. We're having here today Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Russian politician and former political prisoner, currently the Renew Democracy Initiative Dissident-in-Residence at Georgetown. He is also a vice president of the Free Russia Foundation, senior advisor at Human Rights First, and senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. Vladimir Kara-Murza was the founding chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. He is a contributing writer at the Washington Post, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize in 2024, and has authored and contributed to multiple books on Russian history and politics. In 2026, Kara-Murza was named a member of the European Council platform for dialogue with Russian democratic forces. He is a recipient of the Council of Europe's Václav Havel Human Rights Prize and an honorary fellow at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, where he also earned an MA in history. In dialogue with him today is Michael David Fox, who is director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University, professor in the School of Foreign Service and Department of History. He is founding and executive editor of Critica journal, and author or editor of 15 books. His single-authored books include Revolution of the Mind, Higher Learning Among the Bolsheviks, showcasing the Great Experiment, Cultural Diplomacy and Western Visitors to the Soviet Union, Crossing Borders, Modernity, Ideology and Culture in Russia and the Soviet Union, and in 2025, the award-winning Crucibles of Power, Smolensk under Stalinist and Nazi rule. His most recent edited volume, Interrogating the Interrogators, History, Politics, and the Opening of Soviet Secret Police Archives in Ukraine, is currently in press. David Fox received his PhD from Yale and BA from Princeton. Thank you so much, our dear speakers. This event is also sponsored by the Georgetown University Department of History, Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, our own Jacques Rossi Memorial Fund for the Gulag Research, and Renew Democracy Initiative, RDI. If a representative of the RDI analyst wanted to say a couple of words, please, you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annalise DeArmond, and I am the development coordinator at the Renew Democracy Initiative, RDI. So RDI is an idea advocacy organization working to revive our free society survival instinct, reminding us every day that we have something worth fighting for and that sometimes we actually have to fight for it. I want to start off by saying that on behalf of RDI, we are so excited to have our Frontlines Fellow, Vladimir Kara-Murza, here as part of our Dissidents-in-Residence program. Vladimir, as mentioned, is a political dissident and writer from Russia. He was in prison for over 2 years for protesting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And while in prison, he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for the columns that he wrote from within his cell. RDI's Frontlines of Freedom program unites a global community of over 100 political dissidents from more than 40 repressive countries. Each of them have dedicated their lives to championing freedom. Through firsthand testimony from those who have lived directly under authoritarian rule, our dissidents help us to understand just how unique America's system truly is and why we need to preserve and strengthen it. Dissident voices carry a unique power precisely because they come from outside our political system. Their stories transcend partisan divides that we see here, and they're able to speak to what is truly at stake when democracy fails. The central goal of our program is to provide a broader perspective for young Americans. I, like many of you, was born and raised in democracy. Like a fish in water, it can be easy for us to take for granted the freedoms that we were born into, that we see every day, and that you've always known. or to catastrophize our current challenges without the proper context of what things look like when those freedoms are truly gone. Dissidents, however, offer a powerful reality check in this situation because they've lived that reality. By offering you a chance to directly engage with dissident fellows, we hope to renew appreciation for democratic institutions here in the United States. So thank you all so much for coming today for this important conversation, and thank you to Georgetown University, and of course, thank you to both of our speakers, Vladimir Kara-Murza and Professor Michael David Fox. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annalise, for this forward. But for now, let's return to the main subject of our today's talk, which is the Gulag, that in many ways belongs to history, but also refuses to remain in the past. The Gulag is often associated with the closed chapter of the 20th century, with Stalinism and the violence of the Soviet era. Yet, one of the premises of our today's discussion is that the Gulag is not only the political phenomena. It is also a question of memory, institutions, and political inheritance, of how societies remember repression, and what happens when that memory becomes contested. One striking example of such repression is, one might say, final closure of the Museum of the History of the Gulag in Moscow in February. This was not simply a disappearance of the cultural political institution. Rather, it reflects a broader struggle over historical memory in contemporary Russia. So this closure gives us basically an important starting point for this discussion today, inviting us to ask not only what Gulag actually was, but why its memory continues to matter nowadays. This is where, I guess, scholarship becomes essential. At Georgetown, the Jacques Rossi Memorial Fund for the Gulag Research, which is the co-sponsor of our today's conversation, supports the study and documentation of Soviet repression for over a decade. The fund is named after Jacques Rossi, whom many of you, I'm pretty sure, know very well, who was the Polish-French writer arrested in the Soviet Union in 1930s and who later documented his experience in the camps. During his years at Georgetown, he completed his famous Gulag Handbook, which remains a foundational scholarly source for us. And established in 2013, the Rossi Fund here at Georgetown since supported research and academic initiatives dedicated to advancing the study and preservation of Gulag history. So events such as today's one continue this effort basically to examine the history of political repression in Russia across historical epochs, political systems, and lived experiences. And of course, the systems of exile and punishment in Russia did not start and begin with the Soviet Union. Under Tsarist Empire, Siberian exile already functioned as a tool of governance, colonization, mechanism of punishment, and political control through distance and isolation. So Soviet Union transformed these earlier practices into a larger and more systematic vast network of camps that embedded within the political and economic functioning of the state. So this raises an enduring historical question for us for today. Do institutions disappear when regimes collapse? Or do certain practices, logics, mechanisms survive over these political changes? In other words, how should we think about continuity and rupture between these imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet periods? And do institutional cultures outlive ideologies that produce them? So with that, I would like to begin with Vladimir. Vladimir, do you think institutions of punishment such as Gulag outlive the political regimes that created them?
Thank you so much, Anna, for the kind introduction. Thank you to everyone who is here today, and it's always an honor to speak at Georgetown University. And there's just one phrase that I would dispute, Anna, that you said in your introduction. You said that the Gulag belongs to history. Unfortunately, it really doesn't. And the reality that exists in Russia today under Vladimir Putin is a direct continuation of what we saw under the communist regime. And in fact, you know, when I was in prison myself, and when I was rereading some of the memoirs by Soviet dissidents, people like Vladimir Bukovsky and Natan Sharansky and others, I had this most surreal feeling of actually living inside one of these books, because it is astonishing how much everything in the Russian Gulag system, down to the smallest details, has remained exactly the same as it was in that time half a century ago. You know, the way prison guards speak to you, the way your cell is organized, the prison day is structured, everything is exactly the same. And it's not only the same in sort of the practicalities and the day-to-day life on that archipelago, but of course the situation, the more general situation regarding political repression in Russia is much worse than it has ever been, not only in the post-Soviet period, that goes without saying, but I would argue even in the Soviet period in the post-Stalin era since 1953. When I received my 25-year prison sentence, that was the first time a political prisoner received such a sentence, Stalinsky Четвертак, as Solzhenitsyn calls it, Stalin's 25, since 1953. There have been others since then, because the sentences, the length of sentences now, are back to what they were in Stalinist times. And if we talk about the scope of repression, the latest figures from Memorial, the leading human rights organization in Russia, show the number of politically motivated criminal cases standing at around 4,500 people. The number of known, identified political prisoners in Russia today stands at about 1,900. And I want to stress the word known, because there are so many political prisoners who are not on anybody's radars, whose names, you know, we do not hear in parliamentary hearings, and we do not read about them in human rights reports and so on. The week before our prisoner exchange in the summer of 2024, a talented pianist and musician named Pavel Kushnir died on a hunger strike in a prison in Birobidzhan in eastern Siberia. He was in prison for having spoken out against the war in Ukraine, but nobody knew about him until he died. We only learned about him, and we learned his name after it was announced that he had died of a hunger strike. And how many such Pavel Kushnirs there are in the Russian prison system today, nobody knows. But even if we take the publicly available known number of Russian political prisoners, I think it's 1,955, according to OVD info. That is more, and just think about this, this is more than there were political prisoners in the whole of the Soviet Union, that is 15 different countries put together, in the mid-1980s, 4 decades ago. When the Vienna meeting on security and cooperation in Europe opened in January 1987, there were about 750 known political prisoners in the Soviet Union, according to the human rights organizations. Today in Russia alone, almost 2,000. On average every day, and this again is a figure from Memorial, every single day, on average 5 people in Russia are targeted by some form of political repression, whether it's a criminal case, an administrative indictment, police detention, and so on. So in all ways, in sort of in a very practical matter of everyday existence in that prison system, but also in the general scope of repression in Putin's Russia, unfortunately that history is still very much alive. And I think later on in this conversation we'll go into some of the reasons why we are finding ourselves in this situation. But another sort of phrase I would pick on, Anna, is what you said is, can institutions survive the change of regimes? Well, the problem, of course, is that the regime has not really changed. And when we saw, after a brief interlude of political freedom and democracy in Russia in the 1990s, we saw the reappearance not only of the old practices of the communist era regime, but actually of the very same people. Let's not forget that Vladimir Putin personally participated in arrests, interrogations, and searches of dissidents in Leningrad in the 1970s as an officer of the Soviet KGB. These are the same people, this is the same system, and of course the Gulag as it exists today is exactly the same as the one we had back in the Soviet Union.
Should I answer that?
Thank you so much,
okay.
Vladimir. Yes, maybe now you can help us historicizing that further, Michael.
Well, as a historian, I'm fascinated by these continuities over radical regime changes or ruptures, historical, how does that work? But I'll answer your question by telling you a sort of personal story about how in 2013, the same year as the Jacques Rossi Fund was founded, I traveled to the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea near the Arctic Circle, which was the site of Solovki, the prototype of the Gulag. And when I got there, of course, as Anna mentioned, the Tsarist exile system, but also the previous system of exile to the far north, to remote locations, was the precursor to the Gulag, and this was embodied in the monastery itself, where we visited the cells that heretics from the Orthodox Church, but also political prisoners, you could call them, from the 16th and 17th century had lived. And for me, that exemplifies how the Soviet regime sort of built on the previous legacy of, in all three regimes, including post-91 in Russia, exile to the far remote regions, and that's a continuity, a basic continuity. In the 1920s, Solovki was after the Red Terror, many of the concentration camps that had existed in the Civil War period of 1918 to 20 were taken away from what was then the Cheka, the secret police, but Solovki remained its major camp. And this was in the late 20s, where they came up with the notion, and apparently it was some sort of NEP man or someone imprisoned for basically entrepreneurial black market, at the time, crimes, right, came up with the idea of linking the prison labor to the prison population to forced labor and colonization of the North. So that, after 1930, there was a vast expansion of the camp network under the auspices of the secret police. And this is where I would push back. I think there are major continuities, but I don't think these systems are exactly the same. What's interesting is that there are particularities that continue over time. But the Gulag in scale, right, from 1930 to basically 53 and then 56, when the mass scale of it was minimized or taken away. I mean, there were other forms of repression that succeeded it, but like psychiatric hospitals, but the vast network of forced labor, but which also served as a repository for political prisoners, but also was a regular part of the penal system. Some 25 million people cycled through that Gulag system in the course of the Stalin period, right? And also Solovki, or the Solovetsky archipelago, because it was an archipelago of islands, was actually where the Gulag got its name. So one of the prisoners there for 5 years was the academician Likhachov, who was well known for his study of early Russian culture, and he was friends with Solzhenitsyn. And according to something he wrote much later, Solzhenitsyn was doing his interviews, which became, when they were published in the West in 73, 74, really the main source of what we knew about the Gulag. And he was talking to Likhachov, and he told him about the Latvian camp commandant in Solovki, who called himself the head of the troops of the Solovetsky archipelago. And Solzhenitsyn said, that is the metaphor that I'm looking for, the archipelago. And that's apparently where the name for the book, Gulag Archipelago, was born. And since 1991 until about 2022, there was a flourishing of Gulag studies. It's really a small but quite remarkable field that was studied by major Russian scholars. Documents were published, 7-volume study called Historia Stalinskого Gulaga, History of the Stalinist Gulag, that's I acquired for Lauinger Library. One of the editors was one of my teachers, Danilov, Viktor Petrovich Danilov, was a great historian of the peasantry and collectivization. So Russians contributed to this. They contributed to the Gulag Museum that was closed, which was quite a good museum. But Western scholarship also took full opportunity to go into the Gulag archive in Moscow. And what we found actually, or what the research has found, is that it was not so much of a completely separate archipelago, in that it had many connections to the forced and semi-forced labor and Stalin system in the rest of Soviet society. So you can push these things to the margins, but they are always interconnected with what's going on in the center. And I think now the future of Gulag studies is kind of uncertain, but the former KGB archives are now available in Kiev, something we never had in Moscow, and in the Baltic states. So I think hopefully a future generation of Russians will return to the work they started.
Thank you both for such powerful statements about this question of continuity versus rupture. Maybe now we can discuss in a little bit more detail the context the Gulag was created. And as Michael mentioned, it was the context of the first 5-year plan and internal colonization of the North when in this colonization of the remote regions was seen as a primary objective by creating the empire of forced labor observed by the secret police. So how did these circumstances of Gulag's creation shape the history of the institution? And is Gulag unique in its context and in the objective of targeting both basically being the institution of political repression and of economic exploitation? How can we compare it to now with like post-Soviet penitentiary system?
Well, Professor David Fox mentioned the horrendous figure, 25 million people who circled through the system. And he mentioned, of course, the Solovki camp, which was the first concentration camp anywhere in Europe. 1.5 decades before the Nazi concentration camps. And I was in Geneva last week to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and I had an hour free time, so I was just walking around Old Town, and I suddenly saw there's a memorial plaque to Lenin on one of the buildings in Geneva where he lived in the early 20th century, you know, sort of very complimentary plaque saying the founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, with a patronymic, lived here between whatever it was, 1903 and 1904. And I just thought to myself that, you know, it would be unlikely to say memorial plaque to Adolf Hitler on any of the houses he lived. And yet, you know, they were both founders of murderous regimes that killed millions and millions of people, but yet somehow that is, for some reason, separated. And you mentioned, Michael, that, you know, your book on comparing Stalinist and Nazi rule in Smolensk, that's actually now a criminal offense in Russia to even compare them. But I think in the scope of repression that the Soviet Gulag is known for, you know, there are few parallels in world history that we can know of. And this sort of combination of both repression of political enemies and economic exploitation, it's interesting how sort of also personal experiences can shape responses to this and you know, the understanding of this. I remember when I was in Omsk in prison and I was rereading One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Mm-hmm. I actually caught myself inadvertently feeling jealous of the character in Solzhenitsyn's book. You know, a convict in a Stalin-era special labor camp, Asoblag. Why was I jealous? Because every day he was outside, he was talking to other people, he was walking, he saw trees, he saw sky. I was locked into a small cubicle, 3 by 4 meters, that's about 10 by 13 feet, day after day, week after week, month after month. There's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, there's no one to speak to. We know that by international law, solitary confinement for more than 15 days is considered torture. I was in solitary for a full year with no break. And I have to say it takes a special effort not to go crazy in these conditions. So I was actually, and this is, I'm saying this honestly, I was jealous of Ivan Denisovich for the conditions that he was in. So, of course, the Gulag itself, as Professor David Fox mentioned, went through different stages, you know, in its own history. And the names kept changing, right? It was Gulag, then it was Guin, now it's Fsin. But the institution at the core is unfortunately the very same that was founded back in 1918. Yeah,
so I'll add something, and I would like to have maybe a little back in dialogue here, because I'm very interested in what you just said about the solitary confinement. But I do think that the forced labor component was something that was not unique, but one of the distinctive parts of the Gulag. The size and the scale of it was also under Stalin. And so it sort of coincided as the Gulag as such, as this archipelago, from the first 5-year plan in around 1930 to shortly after the death of Stalin as such. Of course, the practices and some of the actual specific sort of policies were from earlier and remained after. But when we think about, like in the late 20s, there were less than 100,000 political prisoners in the Soviet Union, and the Gulag swelled to several million people at any given time. Right, it reached its height in the late 40s and late Stalinism. From my point of view, what makes it distinctive almost in world history is not that huge, only that huge scale, but that it was part of the regular penal system, right? Ordinary convicts, often sentenced for just, minor infractions, especially in the late 30s with the draconian laws against theft of socialist property, being late for work, making an anecdote. You get 5 years in the camps, right? So there's a huge part of the ordinary prison population. This is part of the regular penal system. It's not an atrocity that occurs in wartime in a state of exception, like the Stalinist Great Terror, in anticipation of war perhaps, but still in peacetime, most major atrocities occur in wartime on that kind of scale. But it also included political prisoners. And I was recently reading some of the latest figures. A quarter or up to between a quarter or a third of all the Gulag inmates were sentenced under Article 58 or counter-revolutionaries or some sort of political charge, right? And then the third element is the forced labor component. This was sort of an empire of forced labor under the control of the secret police. So something like 3-4% of the entire laboring population of the Soviet Union in the Stalin years it fluctuated, of course, but was working in the Gulag. It was essentially a form of modern day slavery. I mean, and the way it worked was that, the high priority camps, gold mining, minerals, they got comparatively better rations, but still when you stopped fulfilling your work norms, you were given less to eat and you then deteriorated. And one of the things that Russian historian Mikhail Nakonyechny recently discovered was that when he went to local archives was the widespread practice of releasing prisoners on the verge of death so that they would die outside the camps and not be included in the official mortality rates. So the lowest possible official figures for mortality in the Gulag in the Stalin years, something like 2.4 million, but that doesn't include special settlements, which were not barbed wire camps, but for the exiled kulaks and so on. So we're talking probably much, much higher figures. So the combination of all those three elements, sort of convict labor, economic exploitation, and colonization of remote regions, it was seen as a kind of internal colonization of the country, and political prisoners, all existing in not in war but in peace. I think, like, for example, the warehouses that are being created in this country to house migrants on the verge of deportation, right, could be considered concentration camps, but they are not forced labor camps, nor are they part of the regular penal system. So I'm not sure what you think about that being a sort of distinctive feature, right? I think each penal, I'm sure Putin system does also have its own distinctive features, as the Tsarist did, but I don't think they're identical.
Thank you. And another crucial aspect of the discussion about the Gulag legacies is ideology. Some would argue that Putin's Russia lacks a distinctive ideology of its own, which cannot be more drastically different from the Soviet context, where the celebration of this rehabilitation for labor was a part of celebrating basically selling the Gulag itself, at least internally. So did the ideological cover-up make the difference at the time of the Soviet Union and later? What you think?
Well, the current regime is bringing back the very same tenets, at least externally. I mean, I don't think many people who were in the Soviet leadership actually believed in all this stuff. That was the official justification. But again, down to the smallest details, when I would be taken to the office of the head of the prison's operation department in Omsk, he had a portrait of Felix Dzerzhinsky on the wall, the founder of the Cheka, today, well, 2 years ago, 2024. And of course, when Putin only came in to power at the end of 1999, I remember, there's this sort of fashionable myth, sometimes propagated by analysts, policymakers, journalists, both in Russia and in the West, very often for reasons of self-justification, that there were sort of two different Putins, right? There was the early Putin, who was supposedly okay, who believed in modernization and reform and cooperation with the West, and then something went horribly wrong along the way. Nothing could be further from the truth. I am no oracle by any means, but I remember the exact day when I understood just who Vladimir Putin was and what direction he was going to take our country. This was December the 20th, 1999, when Putin, still prime minister at the time, came to Lubyanka Square in Moscow, the site of the old KGB, now FSB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Andropov was somebody, of course, as you well know, who symbolized everything that was wrong with the Soviet communist system, both in terms of internal repression and in terms of external aggression. He was one of the architects of the invasion of Hungary in 1956 as Soviet ambassador in Budapest to crush the anti-communist revolution. As longtime head of the KGB, he expanded that horrendous practice of punitive psychiatry that Professor David Fox referred to, when dissidents were declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in so-called special psychiatric hospitals. He also set up a special directorate within the KGB called the Fifth Chief Directorate, specifically to go after dissidents and to crush any political dissent at home. That was Andropov's legacy. And it was to him that Putin chose to unveil a memorial plaque in December of 1999. Russia is a country of symbols, and Putin could not have chosen a stronger or clearer signal to show the direction of his future rule. And again, I'm no oracle, but after that day, I had no more questions. And if anybody was still unsure, the first year of his presidency in 2000, 26 years ago, Putin reinstated the Soviet national anthem that was once personally picked by Joseph Stalin. So if there is any ideological facade for this regime, it's exactly the same that they're bringing back from Soviet times, and the closure of the Gulag Museum that Joanna referenced at the beginning. And I may add also the removal of the monument to Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Vladivostok just last week, I think are very clear manifestations of this re-Sovietized ideology that the Putin regime is putting up as its ideological basis.
I think what you just said about Andropov points to actually one of the keys to this whole problem of how practices survive across the regime change, because the FSB was the successor to the KGB. There never was a kind of destruction of that institution. That institution had a clear continuity. That was something that was never taken away in 1990, 1991, although there were some calls for that. The question of how the Bolsheviks managed to build on the people they fought against in the Tsarist regime and overthrew in the February Revolution, but they rejected the Tsarist legacy, and yet they built on it. That is a little more of a mystery, but some historians would say that in the many incarcerations that the revolutionaries had, they closely watched the Tsarist secret police methods, the Okhrana, and that they were quite familiar with them. I mean, we also know that they were looking internationally. Like Trotsky was an early, he was a journalist, worked as a journalist, a war journalist. I mean, the first concentration camps were created in the Boer War in Cuba at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and then in the Trotsky was watching these developments, so were Tsarist military officials, and so it became part of these international practices. There were camps created, especially in the 20th century, and so there are resemblances with what's going on in other countries. But again, I personally would say that the question was about the ideology of it. Like, I would personally say that the Putin regime sort of has its generational roots in the late Soviet period. Many of them were young in the late Soviet period, and so they've sort of returned to that Brezhnev and Andropov mode, whereas under Stalin, what you actually had was a kind of this legacy of the early Soviet stress on rehabilitation through labor, which pretended to be humane and often was violated in practice, but there were some indications that it had some meaning, at least within the system, right? And there were some people who survived in these cultural institutions within the Gulag. It became something of a competition among camp directors to have the best orchestras, the best theaters. But this was something that was sort of to showcase that this to the rest of the world, that this was rehabilitation. And in 1934, there was that famous Belomor Canal publication where the White Sea Canal, which was extremely costly, economically disastrous, but many of the best writers, intellectuals, former avant-gardists like Rodchenko participated in this glorification of it as a humane. Maxim Gorky was heavily involved with all of this. So socialist realism created this kind of picture of enthusiasm and rehabilitation and humaneness that was completely violated in practice. And I think that's one of the most kind of monstrous things about the Gulag. That was already gone, I think, by the late Soviet period, which the current regime is sort of more harking back to, perhaps. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Discussing empires and their life cycles, we, I would say, tend to forget the so-called periphery. So it would be important for us to localize these repressions. And for someone who specializing on the history of Siberia, my next question would probably be concerned about the so-called marginalized region that served under Tsarist and Soviet regime and keeps serving now as the basically territory for outcasts to be exiled and their labor to be used, right? So Vladimir, you were imprisoned in Siberia, the region that historically was associated with all these tendencies, with exile and forced labor. How, in your opinion, does geography, regions marginalization, does it still function as a tool of punishment and isolation of prison population? Maybe something about ethnic minorities that you observed?
So I was imprisoned in Omsk, and among prisoners, Omsk, by sort of the letters, is known as отдаленное место ссылки каторжников, a remote place of exile for convicts. Of course, there's no actual connection, but it's just from a local river. That's where the name comes from. But that's sort of the second name, and we can understand why it's there, because Siberia in general, but Omsk in particular, has been a favorite place for exiling opponents of the regimes across different centuries, across generations. Some of the Decembrists were imprisoned in Omsk, including Basargin and others, after the failed 1825 uprising. Dostoevsky, of course, was famously imprisoned in Omsk, and one of the first books I read was the Letters from the House of the Dead, right, which is based on his experience at the Omsk prison. It's now a Dostoevsky museum in that old prison, which I hope to one day be able to go. Wasn't able to see much in my last stay in Omsk, as you can imagine. And then, of course, going to the Soviet period, Solzhenitsyn passed through Omsk on his way to a special labor camp in Kazakhstan, and he writes about it in the Gulag Archipelago. There's a whole chapter on his time at the Omsk transit prison. And more recently, closer to our time, Mustafa Dzhemilev, the leader of the Crimean Tatar national movement, was imprisoned at the Omsk prison, the same one I was in the mid-1970s, and held the longest prisoner hunger strike on record, still to this day, in the mid-70s, when Sakharov writes in his memoirs how he came to Mustafa's trial there. And so it's sort of very appropriate in the worst way possible that today's political prisoners are also finding themselves in places like Omsk. And this tradition is there. And what I was surprised about, Anna, to your question about sort of the different peculiarities of the local area and sort of the ethnic mix-up of the population. I was very surprised to find out that I was in 4 different prisons when I was at Omsk. And in at least 2 of them, the main ones, half of all the prison officials, they either had Kazakh last names or German last names. And the Kazakh last names is logical because Omsk actually has a very large and very historically rooted Kazakh diaspora. About 25% of the population in Omsk are ethnic Kazakhs. And my prison was only 120 kilometers from the border of Kazakhstan, so it's essentially the same area. But the Germans I was surprised about because, of course, we all know that the Volga Germans were exiled into southwestern Siberia, northern Kazakhstan in 1941. But sort of the conventional wisdom is that all of them had left. And many did leave, but many stayed. And a lot of my prison officials were ethnic Germans, and I would ask them, are you from among the exiled Volga Germans? They would say yes, which raises a whole separate ethical issue of how, somebody who's a descendant of a repressed nation can go on and repress others himself. But I guess that's more for anthropologists to answer than historians. But that was a revelation for me, actually. I was not aware that there's still actually such a big German community in that part of Russia, and I'm guessing in northern Kazakhstan too. And in fact, I've been told by one of my prison guards that before the full-scale war in Ukraine, so up until February 2022, there was actually a regular direct Lufthansa flight between Omsk and Frankfurt, because there are enough families on both sides that would go and see each other regularly. So you mentioned Likhachov and Solovki. Of course, he worked on pursued his linguistic studies in the camp, right? Yes, he worked on the prison language, yes. And you wrote a book about it later on. So I guess for me as a historian, that was also an experience that opened my eyes to some of those things. Thank you for the question.
So in terms of the remoteness of the space, the spatial aspects, the fact that there were these remote peripheries, I mean, there was the Tsarist exile system, but also hard labor, right? You mentioned katorgnikov, right? Mm-hmm. Katorga, I mean, that's forced labor. So those 2 things, exile and labor, and even in the Soviet period, you could be exiled like 100 kilometers from Moscow or to some more remote location. So isolation, this is something that comes from the continental space of the empire. And I think that's one thing. I read this book by Judith Pallo, a sociologist at Oxford, who really studied the continuities with of the post-Soviet Russian penal system with the Soviet. And in terms of the remote locations, right, what she showed this very strong continuity, but she, interestingly enough, in that book, she points about several moments where that system of having these remote far north Siberian and Central Asian locations in at least the Soviet period could have been reversed. And that was in the 1920s, and that was never done. And then again after 1991, where they could have created a prison system that wasn't based on this kind of isolation model, which creates all sorts of problems for people visiting them, from abuse of prisoners because it's not under anyone's, can't be monitors. Mm-hmm. And so there was this potential to reform the penal system after 91, but it was never realized. The other thing I'd like to say is just the economic non-viability of this, because post-Soviet Russia has inherited these far north cities that grew up around the Gulag camps, and it's extremely expensive and economically difficult to maintain them. So it's an economic drain. And the Gulag itself, although I think that the Stalin leadership became sort of addicted to forced labor and thought that it was somehow free to supply these remote camps. And it dictated also the structure of the camps, because you couldn't have enough guards. So you had the convicts rule over the political prisoners in a kind of hierarchy of self-governing prisons, because there were so few guards in these remote locations. So, but I think economists would agree today that virtually all the Gulag forced labor projects could have been done better and more cheaply by free labor. So many of those, like the Belomor Canal itself, was dug too shallow, so it had to be completely redone. So economically, this system is a drain. It's a cost. And the final thing about the ethnic composition, I visited, as I was telling Vladimir before, Karaganda, which is in northern Kazakhstan, the site of the largest Gulag camp. And in fact, there were 18 ITLs, how would you translate it?
Исправительно трудовой лагерь, yeah?
So the
correctional
labor camps within that huge complex. So 18 kind of separate camps within this giant territory. All sorts of people passed through there. And I can say more about what I discovered there, but one thing I would say is that there's an excellent museum of the Gulag there in a village called Dolinka, where the headquarters of the entire Gulag was. And many of the visitors there were Russians coming to see this excellent museum. But there were so many ethnic groups coming through Kazakhstan because they were exiled there, they were put in the Gulag there. It really had an effect on the ethnic composition of Kazakhstan today. So I guess I'll stop there. Oh, one more thing. I saw about this incredible research. We had a visiting Uzbek sociologist who teaches in Sweden, who had done research on the prison systems where he was looking at migrant Muslim guest laborers. There's a huge Muslim labor force from Central Asia in the Russian Federation, and many of them are in prison. And he actually had like footage of people taking pictures of the cell phones inside these prisons from a few years ago. And what he showed was that these camps, these prisons, some of them were religious oriented and run by clerics. Others were run by secular figures, but it was the same principle of saving money on guards and administration and having the prisoners sort of run their own camps. It was incredible to see that continuity just sort of on phone footage from the people that he knew from within the prisons, sending it to him in Uzbekistan.
I'm glad that you mentioned how different is the politics of memory reflected in regions versus in Moscow, even up to recently on our days. So I suggest to return to this recent closing of the Gulag Museum in Moscow. Why you think these debates about the Gulag are still politically sensitive in Russia? In past, 20 years ago, Putin has acknowledged the crimes of Stalinism, but increasingly in these recent years, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, those are submerged to rehabilitation of Stalin's cult image. Does Russia have at all prospects of democratic change without working on its historical traumas, repressed memories of the past? What do you think?
That, to me, is actually the key to everything that we're talking about today. And Professor David Fox already referred to the fact that the KGB was only renamed rather than disbanded in the early 1990s. And to me, the main reason for the failure of Russia's democratic experiment in the 1990s was, not in corruption, not in loans for share scandals, not in any of this economic stuff. Yes, it was bad, and things should have been done differently. But as we know, unfortunately, corruption can exist in democratic countries too. But you cannot have a democracy if you have a KGB. And so to me, the root of the problem was the fact that after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet regime, Russia never really went through a process of a real reckoning with the Soviet past. There was never any real accountability for the crimes of the Soviet regime. We know from the history of any country that has successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, be it Argentina after military junta, South Africa after apartheid, Central and Eastern European states after communism, and so on, that every one of these countries, in different ways, with different methods, went through a process that lawyers like to call transitional justice, and that it is really all about transparency and accountability. Again, different ways in different countries. Military tribunals in Argentina, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, lustration laws in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Baltic states, and so on. But the essence was always the same. All the documents detailing the crimes of the former regimes were made public, and the practices and ideologies of these regimes were officially and irrevocably condemned on the state level and on the level of society. And of course, the people responsible for these crimes were held to account. There were moves and there were calls for a similar process of transparency and accountability in Russia in the early 1990s. And perhaps the two most prominent figures who were at the forefront of that movement were Vladimir Bukovsky, the legendary Soviet-era dissident who spent more than 12 years in the Gulag in the 60s and 70s, was forcibly expelled from the Soviet Union in 1976 in exchange for Chilean Communist Party leader Luis Corvalán, who had been imprisoned by the Pinochet junta in Chile, and then came back to Russia in 1991. He spent, all of 1992 going around every government office he could find in Moscow, trying to persuade Yeltsin's officials to open the archives, to conduct trials, to bring people to account, to do what had been done in countries that successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. And all he would hear in response from these officials would be, they'd just shrug their shoulders and they'd say, no, we're not going to do this. What you're calling for is going to be a witch hunt, they said. That's the phrase they use, a witch hunt. And so Bukovsky responded that in that case, the witches will come back and start hunting us. And that, of course, was exactly what happened when a Soviet KGB officer came to power in 1999 and opened up plaque to Andropov. The second leading figure in that movement was, of course, Galina Starovoytova, a member of parliament from St. Petersburg, one of the leaders of the Democratic Russia movement, who actually introduced on two different occasions a draft lustration law into the Russian parliament, modeled on a law that had already by then been passed in Czechoslovakia in 1991. And what that law would have done was very simple. It stated that, didn't propose, mass trials or mass arrests, nothing like that. It only said that anybody who was in the hierarchy of the Soviet Communist Party at the national or regional level, or anybody who was an employee, an agent, or an informer of the Soviet KGB would no longer be able to occupy any position of executive authority. Same as was done in Czechoslovakia, later Poland, Baltic states, and other countries. Had that law been passed, Vladimir Putin, who was a Soviet KGB officer who personally participated in repressions against dissidents in Leningrad in the 1970s, would not even have been able to become deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, let alone prime minister or president of Russia. But that law, as we know, was never passed. And to me, that is the root of the problem. And as you said, Michael, absolutely rightly, the KGB was only renamed. The three letters on the facade would change. The organization remained the same. The people remained the same. And that was the root of the problem. Because when evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it is going to return. And this is what we saw in Russia in 1999. And herein lies a very important lesson for the future, because the Putin regime is not forever. It will be gone, and there will be another window of opportunity for democratic change in Russia. And I think it can be in a very foreseeable future. And it is that lesson that we need to learn from the 1990s and not repeat that same mistake. Because after Putin, Russia will have to go through this process of transparency and accountability for all the crimes committed under the Soviet regime, because that was never really done, and of course, for all the crimes committed that are still being committed by Vladimir Putin and his system, both against our own people in Russia, the murders of opposition leaders, Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny, persecution of thousands and thousands of political prisoners, and of course all the crimes they committed in other countries in the time they've been in power. The Republic of Georgia, Ukraine the first time, Syria, Ukraine the second time. All these crimes will have to be held to account, or the criminals will have to be held to account, otherwise we will not have a normal, civilized, democratic future. So to me, that's the essential lesson we need to learn from the 1990s to avoid repeating the same mistake. And just sort of a small illustration of how much of a full circle Russia has made in everything that we've been talking about, sort of connecting the old Stalinist Gulag to the present day. My grandfather, Alexei Kara-Murza, also a journalist, also a historian, was arrested in 1937, convicted under Article 5810, anti-Soviet agitation propaganda, and sent to the Bamlag, which was a big camp in the Far East, in what is today the Khabarovsk region. And prisoners there were building the Baikal-Amur Railway. That was when that project began. And just before, literally a few weeks before my own arrest, I was at GARF, the State Archive in Moscow, reading the criminal case file of my grandfather from the NKVD in 1937. It's been declassified. I was able to get it in the archive. I was sitting there reading it. And I was reading his indictment order from the NKVD from December the 19th, 1937. And the crime that was, enumerated there, the crime for which he was convicted, of course, I'm placing the word crime in quotation marks, was expressing hostility towards the leaders of the party and the government. That was his crime. Fast forward 2023, April 2023, when I received my 25-year prison sentence from Moscow City Court, one of my crimes enumerated in the indictment order and in the sentence was expressing public hostility towards the leadership of the Russian Federation, including the President of the Russian Federation, end of quote. So they are literally lifting direct phrases from NKVD indictment orders from 1937 and inserting them into indictment orders today. And the root of all that lies in that failure in the early 1990s to really break with the Soviet past. And we cannot repeat that mistake next time.
I think what Vladimir has just said about missed opportunities is very important. And I'll only add that in the 90s, where I spent much of the decade in Moscow in the archives, we didn't realize that we thought things were being opened up because the archives were partially opened, because all these books about Stalinism were being published. But what we didn't realize that only a tiny segment of sort of elites and intellectuals in capital and the capital city, and not the entire society, was actually reckoning with this past. And I think in retrospect, what I would emphasize now is that this whole cyclical development of trying to open up and then having it reversed, it has deep roots in cycles of reform and reaction that go very far back into the Russian past. But in this immediate context of the Gulag, it started right in the thaw. There were the friends and the foes of reform, which is the title of one important book about that era. And they were blocks. And at times the reformists were on top. At times the conservatives, the anti-reformists, got the upper hand. But this struggle went on. And then after 91, the reformists were ostensibly on top, but we didn't realize how this block of sort of anti-reformists who believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century were actually persisting and actually radicalizing in the course of the 90s. And some of those radical right figures of the 90s later became mainstream within the Russian Federation after circa 2011, especially after 2014. And so to answer your question about why the Gulag is still such a contested topic, it's because history itself is a code for what your politics are. Mm-hmm. If you talk about, say, a few words about Stalin, anyone can tell where you are politically. And the run-up to the war in Ukraine was so heavily dependent on a version of history that justified the invasion. And we see that happening years before 2022, that history, the politics of history, are really actually just a surrogate for the politics of the present.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I would just briefly add to that as a trained historian, I might not personally like very much the term lessons of history. But as a citizen, as a human being whose great-grandfather was purged in 1937 as an Estonian nationalist, and whose family bears the legacy of those repressions, I could not subscribe more under what you've just said about basically Russian democratic prospects and future without learning these historical lessons and traumas, living through them, and how important it is. So our time for this debate and my exclusive opportunity of asking questions is unfortunately over for now, and we can switch to the next part of our conversation when we turn to the audience and their questions. So please signal to me your interest in asking the question, identify yourself, and I will pass you the microphone to ask our distinguished speakers your question. Thank you.
While you're waiting, I just can't resist saying something about lessons of the past, because I think Vladimir always is emphasizing how we need to make those lessons, as historians are trained not to sort of to try to be professionally objective about the past. And therefore, we cede the territory of drawing lessons to non-historians, right? And I started getting interested in this when I read a book it was someone writing in the German context, where the philosophy of drawing lessons from difficult pasts, as you might imagine, is quite well developed in the field of German philosophy. And there are ways in which you can do this as professional historians, right, and not cede the territory to just people who don't really know the past. So I think with Vladimir's study of history and concern with drawing those lessons, that's an important combination that we can actually learn from. So.
And I fully agree with you about not ceding the ground. And as Vasily Kluchevsky, the great 19th century Russian historian, once said, history does not teach anyone anything, it only punishes for lessons unlearned. And it's finally time that we start learning those lessons.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Harley Balzer. And I was struck by your comment about the difference between Solzhenitsyn walking in outdoors every day and the locked-in prison. My version of that is that, from the same Solzhenitsyn source, the scientists and engineers were put in the Sharashki to work on things that might benefit the war effort in the Soviet Union. Putin has really executed dozens of scientists, a lot of them from Novosibirsk, including people who were accused of working with the Iranians and the Chinese, who are supposed to be the friendly countries. I'm wondering if we can find more of that. Putin seems to be even more destructive than Stalin, if that's possible to imagine.
So I think this point goes back to what Professor David Fox said earlier, that the present-day prison system, at least the political part of it in Russia, bears more resemblance to the 60s and 70s than it does to the Stalin era. I would say there are elements of all of it. So, for example, my sentence, 25 years, you did not see sentences like this in the 60s and 70s, not since 1953. And also the fact that the current political trials are completely closed. In the 60s and 70s, of course, the courtrooms would be filled with KGB operatives and Komsomol activists, so they would not be really open. But at least there was a pretense of people in the courtroom. And also, usually the closest family members of the accused could come in. And that's why we know about their trials. Like Sharansky's brother was there, making notes. I was completely alone. So that's back to Stalin's time. So many elements do go back to Stalin's time. But in this particular point, the way the quote-unquote most dangerous political prisoners like Navalny, me, and others are being held today is the same way that Sharansky and Bukovsky and Orlov were held back in the 1970s. This constant solitary confinement. You would not find this. Even the Sharashka that you mentioned, right? Yeah. The first circle. Yes, they were in an enclosed space, but they could talk to each other. The torture is a lack of human contact. That's why by international law it's torture. I never understood that rule, by the way. I knew it. It's in the Nelson Mandela rules, the United Nations standard minimal rules for the treatment of prisoners. It says more than 15 days solitary confinement is torture. I never understood why, but I really do now. Because when you just sit in this enclosed space without, with going days on end without even saying hello to another human being, you start going crazy. You start forgetting names, you start forgetting words, you start shouting at walls. I mean, it's a really fine line between sanity and insanity. And so I really benefited from actually knowing about the experience of people like Sharansky and Bukovsky back in the 70s and what they did to stay sane in those conditions. Bukovsky would design imaginary castles, hence the title of his book, To Build a Castle, which, by the way, I recommend to anybody interested in 20th century Russian history. It's an amazing book. He was creating this parallel reality for himself, designing mantelpieces and staircases and chandeliers, sort of this parallel reality that was not controlled by his jailers. Sharansky, of course, would play mental chess games against himself. He writes about it in Fear No Evil, constantly playing mental chess matches. He also wrote that the good news was whatever happens, he would always win. That was his way of staying sane. Unfortunately, I'm hopeless at chess, contrary to stereotypes you may have heard about Russians. But I knew of the experience of what you need to do. The key is you have to channel your mental energy into something practical and constructive to get out of this endless cycle of walling thoughts. And so I was able to get a hold of a Spanish textbook, and I was just sitting there learning morning till night, day after day, week after week. And of course, I didn't hope to ever use any of that Spanish, but staying sane was a strong enough incentive to make myself do this every single day. And guess what? Last week I was in Madrid to meet with members of the Spanish Parliament, and none of them spoke English, so actually it did come in handy. So even prison time can be used for something practical.
I want to actually, I think you've corrected something I said before. I would modify it, because I do think originally for the Putin generation, right, the generation of leaders in Russia, who are 30 years older, for example, than the leaders of Ukraine. It's a different generation.
Absolutely.
But their main orientation was the late Soviet period. But I completely agree that they took things from the mid-20th century, and like those 25-year sentences. And in the dissident movement referred, I think, who was it who said the carnivorous and the vegetarian phases?
Yeah,
this has become, after 2022, a carnivorous period. And it has something very different from the 60s and 70s when we were talking with Benjamin Nathans last year about dissidents and his book on dissidents. They use Soviet legality against the Soviet system. You can't think of doing that now because they would just not care. They don't care about international opinion about whether they're violating legality or not. This is a different phase of Putinism. The other thing I would say in response to Anna's remark about memories of the Gulag in different parts of the country, I read a book about the Komi Republic by Tyler Kirk, recently came out. He teaches in Alaska, and he has a lot of material about how there's a very different kind of memory regime in Komi where the camps were, and there's this tradition of local former prisoners playing a real activist role. It goes back to Memorial's work starting in the 90s, and people like, I think it was Urgachev, who later moved to Central Memorial. But he shows that even after 2022, they are commemorating the Gulag in ways which would be unthinkable in, for example, Solovki, where the Orthodox Church has been influential, or in Moscow, or in Petersburg. So I think that's important to remember.
And of course, we have to say, continuing this conversation, to me, the final red line between authoritarian and totalitarian phases of Putinism was February 27, 2015, when Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, the most prominent leader of the Russian opposition, assassinated directly in front of the Kremlin. That, to me, was the final red line. And of course, below beyond the low-level perpetrators, everybody else up the higher chain of command was completely shielded from any responsibility and any justice, as you would not be surprised to hear. So, if you can kill the main opposition leader in the middle of the capital city, you can do anything. So, to me, that was the final red line that the regime crossed. And in terms of the commemorations for the Gulag, what I think is really important is that, despite the fact that everything on the official level is cemented, and it's almost a crime now to even invoke the memory of the Gulag and to speak about it. Look at what happens every year around Russia on October 29th, which was Возвращение имен, the return of the names, which was a ceremony, a commemoration that Memorial initiated years and years ago, on the eve of the Political Prisoner Day, which is October 30th. But on the 29th, people would come to these memorials, and the Solovki stone, of course, in Moscow, right in front of the KGB building, which is still there, a stone brought in the early 90s as a memorial to all the victims of the Gulag. And for years and years, this would be an open public ceremony where thousands of people would come, lay flowers and light candles and read out the names from those расстрельные списки, right, from those execution lists from the 1930s. And of course, not even since the full-scale war, but since COVID initially, but of course, ever since until now, these ceremonies are totally prohibited. And yet every single year, and this past year, 2025 was no exception, thousands of people all over the country still come to those same places where they used to hold these ceremonies, and they still lay flowers, and they still light candles, and they still read out those names. So the popular memory still lives on. They cannot kill memory. They can prohibit the official expressions of it, but they cannot kill it. And I think it's very important to say that, at the same time as everything that we're talking about on the official level, that the popular memory still lives on, and it's impossible to kill it, because there's hardly a family in our country that has not been touched by this.
Thank you for that. I want to continue just by saying, in response to Harley Balzer's question about arresting scientists, I think, and this even, so there are ways in which the Stalin-era Gulag was more rational, right? They created these almost institutes, these sharashki, where scientists were doing important work. They sometimes even arrested scientists who had done nothing so they could add to these communities of forced labor scientists because they believed in science, right? And they didn't do things that were irrational against the national interest in the sort of narrowly utilitarian sense. And in this country and in Putin's Russia, as the invasion of Ukraine has shown, we have governments that are doing things that are openly destructive of science, the foundations of state power, in ways that would be almost unimaginable in the past. And I think that prompts us to think about what we've been saying about the need to kind of reckon with the past is also relevant for this country as we are creating a system of mass incarceration, of these warehouses for people being deported, of the kind of regime that one could hardly imagine happening. There will be a future in which this country has to reckon with that difficult past, and we could miss that opportunity like Russia did in the early 90s.
I'm Paul Carter, retired Foreign Service, and my final overseas posting was as the Consul General in Yekaterinburg. And so Omsk was in my
Consular district, right.
My consular district, and I, in fact,
which years were you there?
17 to 19.
Mm-hmm.
So the consulate is now suspended, closed. There's no Americans there any longer. But I actually did visit the Dostoevsky Museum there in Omsk.
You saw more of Omsk than I did.
Yeah. I also saw Perm 36. Was there twice, actually. I was there in 2001 and then came back in 17 or 18. And it was a big difference. In 2001, it was still run by Memorial, and it was very focused on the political prisoners who had been held there and so on. And when I went back in 2018, it had changed, and the focus was on, they said it was a labor camp for, just in general, for, general population labor camp, and where they had done a lot of work on forestry and, cutting down trees and things like that. So they tried to shift it. Now, I don't know what the status of the thing is today. It may be closed completely today. But another prison I tried to visit was the one in Verkhnaya Uralsk.
Yeah.
We were on a trip, we were going to Magnitogorsk, and we understood that there was a museum at Verkhnaya Uralsk, or at least they advertised it. Mm-hmm. And we showed up at the gate, and in fact just drove right into the prison. It was just, the place was just open. You could just drive right in. And there were prisoners walking around and so on. And we went in and asked, can we see the museum? And we had called in advance, and they said, yeah, you could come. But then when we showed up, we were left kind of standing there for about a half an hour, and then finally the leader, the colonel, I guess, who was in charge, came out to the car and said, no, I'm sorry, you can't come in. You have to arrange that with the Chelyabinsk government, if you want to come, and so on. But it was an interesting excursion because we learned that, this prison had been there. It was a Tsarist prison originally, and then very big during the Soviet era. I mean, people like Kamenev and Zinoviev had been held there. And there were even stories that Raoul Wallenberg had been there for a time. And I don't know if that was true or not.
Do you have a question, Paul?
Actually, I'll let you all,
Well, I do have
continue
something to
with it.
say about Verkhnya Uralsk, because that was what was called a political isolator, politizolyator, in the 1930s. And I once wrote an article about a Yugoslav Trotskyist named Ante Ciliga, who was in prison there, wrote a very famous memoirs. And there was this concentration of high-level oppositionists there in the 1930s, and they would have debates between the Trotskyists and the Mensheviks and all the other different factions. And he said it was the freest place in all of the Soviet Union, because they could politically debate whatever they wanted in that prison. And this points to the fact that, there is a kind of a continuum of freedom and unfreedom, of forced and unfree labor in both the Stalin period, but I think that's more generally true historically, right? And so we have to remember that, for example, the peasantry in the collective farms, they couldn't just simply leave the collective farms until something like 1960, when they got internal passports. So they were effectively in a kind of forced labor confinement, and that was the bulk of the population. So it just points to the fact that there are these paradoxes between what we think of a sort of exceptional, peripheral, isolated thing and the rest of society.
And on Perm 36, if I may, that was an amazing museum. It was founded by enthusiasts in the 90s. Vyacheslav Shmurov, who recently passed away, was the founding director. And of course, you're absolutely right. In the mid-2000s, so this was early on in Putin's rule, they got rid of the original founders and they reprofiled, that was the official explanation, museum, essentially made it a museum of the prison guards rather than of the political prisoners who were there. And everything you just said about, that they pretend it was some kind of a general labor camp, that's just a direct lie, because we know that the three infamous Perm camps, Perm 35, Perm 36, Perm 37, that was part of the Andropov experiment in the mid-90s when he was chairman of the KGB. He decided, because for a long time, and this is, by the way, what was really different between the Stalin-era Gulag and the post-Stalin Gulag. Solzhenitsyn writes about the fact how the regular criminals would essentially terrorize the political prisoners and often would be used as sort of proxy guards, as you both said. In the post-Stalin Gulag, this was the reverse. And the regular criminals had a lot of respect for the political prisoners. And by the way, this is the same today. This is why they keep us in solitary confinement, to prevent contact with anybody else. Mm-hmm. And so Andropov had this experiment in the mid-90s because, these politicals they had this respect and sort of, help from the regular criminals in the camps. Let's separate them out. And so he created three specific political camps, Perm 35, 36, 37, in the mid-70s. And this is where Vladimir Bukovsky was in prison. This is where Sergei Kovalyov was in prison, Anatoly Sharansky, and so many others. So there was nothing there except the political. So this, what they made it into, and this is what it continues to be today. There formally is still a Perm 36 museum, but it has nothing to do with the truth about that place.
Yeah. If I could, real quick, ask you to comment on, one thing I saw in that region as well was a large contingent of descendants of Ukrainians who had come there like in the 30s, who had been exiled there. I don't know, maybe 1 million Ukrainians had come to the Urals at that time. And if you could comment on, in a sense, to borrow Solzhenitsyn's metaphor of the circles of hell here with this, there's a sort of the first, to rename the first circle there of the exiles who weren't really so much in prisons, but they were, exiled into these regions. And, how is that related to the whole Gulag system?
Well, there were whole campaigns of mass deportations, of course, under Stalin. The Germans, the Crimean Tatars, the Greeks, of course, everybody from the Baltic states. In 41, the first wave, and then 49, the second wave. And it was only under Khrushchev in the mid-50s that the exiled nations were allowed to return, with the exception of Crimean Tatars. They were only allowed to return in 1989. They were the last unrehabilitated deported nation in the Soviet Union. But most Balts returned in 56, 57. Chechens, of course, also returned about 56, 57 from Central Asia. But what was a surprise to me, as I already alluded with regard to the Germans, but there were also still a lot of people with Polish last names and Lithuanian last names in Omsk, and I've encountered some of them. Yeah. And so while most of the exiled people came back to their home nations, Some stayed. I mean, I guess it was just too long, maybe there were mixed marriages and they were just got used to the area. So there are still, to this day, in southwestern Siberia, you would still find a lot of descendants of Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Germans, who are still there generations on, of course. That's one of the legacies of the Soviet regime to this day.
And I'll just add very briefly that the collectivization campaign included this deportation of several million so-called kulaks, and it were mostly peasants. So that was one also source of, they might have not have been deported as Ukrainians, but as essentially wealthy peasants who were expropriated during collectivization.
Undesirable social elements.
But in Kazakhstan too, there are many Ukrainians. Okay, there was a question here.
Lessons for America.
Okay. Well,
I'll leave that to you, Michael. I've got enough to deal with in my own country. I'm not going to.
First of all, I will not draw. I'm not versed enough in American affairs. I'm a historian of the former Soviet space, but I will say that when I wrote this book, edited this volume on the Gulag in comparative perspective, everyone's always studied the Gulag separately. And what we did was we had chapters going back to the British Empire with, in the 19th century, and workhouses and concentration camps, and there was
in South Africa.
Well, there were parts of Africa, British colonial Africa, and India as well. And there's a book by Aidan Forth who has it has a chapter on the Gulag, but he's looking at camps throughout the 19th and 20th century in many different countries. So there's a whole comparative history to be written there. But what I did not do is include a chapter on the United States. And I regret that because we have the highest rates of incarceration in our penal system in the world. And I think the second highest is Russia, or vice versa. But we are in societies with legacies of extremely violent pasts, including slavery and Native Americans, that have led historically, and Anna asked about minorities. Well, the U.S. prison system is obviously reflective of higher incarceration percentages for minorities, right? I think we have to grapple with that, and that relates not to the gulags as so much as concentration camps, but as part of the penal system. But there is a history of labor in the U.S. penal system that relates to the aftermath of slavery, of course, with work chain gangs and so forth. So there is a connection, including prison labor, people who are making license plates but are paid $1 an hour, $5 an hour for it, and not a regular wage, and so on. But I'm not trying to draw too many parallels here, but I would say that being aware of a history that is often marginalized in the kind of textbook history that students read in schools is extremely important in any country, because what historians study on the cutting edge of historical scholarship is often vastly different from what is studied in school and even high school and university level textbooks. And I think that's true in US history as well as in Russian history. And I guess the last thing I would say is that the history of these difficult pasts is something, like, I wouldn't be so bold as to prescribe lessons for a situation that's very much in flux. We're in a period of extreme disequilibrium, as political scientists would say, so that anything can happen and we don't know how it's going to resolve. But being immersed, one thing I've been noticing in the last year and 2 months or so is that people don't have much immersion in history, not so much American history, but the history of authoritarian regimes in general, which can inform what's going on. That understanding can inform, and people who are used to an electoral system, a parliamentary system, a system of checks and balances will miss a lot of things that we historians who have spent our lives, for better or for worse, immersed in the worst corners of the 20th century, it doesn't seem so counterintuitive to us.
Thank you. Time for one last question, please.
Thank you both so much. My name is Tanya Paperny. I'm a freelance writer here in DC. Just one quick comment, and then I promise I do have a question to the comment about what America can learn. I think we also needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that this country has never held, facing the legacies of slavery and Native American genocide. And we know that after the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, there actually were more blacks in holding political office in the South than there are today. So we had that moment that similar to what you're describing about 1991, and we failed to take that opportunity partly because of violence of white Southerners. My question is, I too am a descendant of Gulag survivor and Stalinist terror victim, and acknowledging the gravity of the terror that you yourself witnessed and that we have inherited. One thing that gave me hope for a long time was the Last Address project. I don't know if you or others are familiar in Russian, Последний Адрес, kind of, I guess you could say, somewhat grassroots movement to put plaques on the last known residents of victims of Stalin terror. So my great-grandmother was someone who had a plaque, and I was very surprised at how long that project was able to last through the sort of earlier years of Putin's civil society repression. And from what I've heard, now the plaques are starting to be taken down, removed. I don't know if it's, guerrilla efforts or who or what, but I'm curious, Vladimir, if you have thoughts on why that project was able to last sort of so long in the current conditions, and what is it about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that meant it could no longer survive, as far as I understand? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, just a couple of words for those who may not know. The Last Address was an absolutely grassroots project that started about 15, 20 years ago, where people, activists, and of course this was supported by a Memorial Society, they would install small metal plaques on the last known residence address of somebody who was killed during Stalin's Great Terror, 1937, 38, 36, 38. And this was based on and I'm not sure what the English term for that is, камни преткновения.
Stolperstein in German. So
yes. So the stumbling stones, thank you. And I've seen them myself in Germany, where you would walk and you would see a stone with the name of a Jewish family that lived in this house and that was killed in a death camps under Nazi rule. This was where the inspiration for that project came. And I actually was involved in it myself because my great-grandfather was arrested in December 1937, executed in September 1938 as a quote-unquote Latvian spy, of course fully exonerated posthumously as millions of other people in our country. And we tried to get a plaque on the house where he was arrested and where he was led away from. That building now happens to be the Embassy of Brazil. And so the reason we were not able to do it is because the government of Brazil vetoed it, because it's formerly their territory. It's a BRICS country, they're friends to Putin, and so it's the government of Brazil that said, no, you cannot put this plaque up. But on your question, of course we know from the history of Russia, centuries of it, certainly the 20th century, that internal repression and external aggression are two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, they feed each other. A government that does not respect the rights of its own people is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors. And so just as, Putin began by shutting down independent television channels, repressing opposition parties, imprisoning his opponents, and then eventually started crossing the borders of Georgia, then Ukraine in 2014, those processes are connected, very much so. And in the same way, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine reinforced the already existing totalitarian tendencies. And as you know, what remained of independent media in Russia was destroyed completely in February of 2022. So I think the Last Address, this new campaign against the last address is part of the same pattern. But what I think is really important to say, yes, you're absolutely right. Those metal plaques are being taken down, and these are not guerrilla taxis. This is very much done by the authorities. But the next morning, after those metal plaques are taken, people install cardboard plaques on that same spot with that same name. And then the cardboard plaques are taken down, and then a new one comes in its place, and then a new one, and a new one, and a new one. And so this project is not gone. It is very much alive. And it's in the same vein as we were talking about the return of names, возвращение имен, that even though the authorities ban these gatherings and these ceremonies, people still come to the Solovki Stone every 29th of October to light candles and to recite the names. And so they will not be able to destroy that memory, just as they've not been able in 11 years to do anything about the unofficial memorial for Boris Nemtsov on the bridge where he was killed. Countless times they came in to steal the flowers and the candles and the rest of volunteers, but the next morning new flowers reappear. Because you cannot kill memory. And I have absolutely no doubt that in a future post-Putin democratic Russia, those plaques will be back in the metal version, this time supported by the state, and that Russian school children will be compulsorily taken to Gulag museums the way German kids are taken to see Holocaust memorials today.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time and have to conclude here. So please join me in thanking heartily our speakers for today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a good conversation. I wish we had a couple more hours.
Yes, we do.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо.
Большое.
Так, возвращайтесь.